to learn how to make our first functional components. This is actually one of the most important videos in the course because we are going to be using functional components all the time through our projects, way more than class components, which we will explore in the next video. But luckily, functional components are pretty basic, so this is not going to be a very long video and there is nothing to be, apprehensive about or anything. So before we actually go into how to make a functional component, there's a small point that I want to highlight here, and that is that ideally, each component in a React app should exist in its own file and only have one purpose. So if we're making an e-commerce app, which is an example I'm going to be going back to over and over again through the course just because it's basic, we're probably going to have different components to display the products, to display the buy button, to display the nav bar. All of these kind of things are going to have their own components. So try to keep that in mind as we're going forward. But now let's actually go into how to create a functional component. As you can see, the very first step is to create a JS or a JSX file. So looking at this example, you can see in this imaginary e-commerce app, you have a page called products that is in its own directory inside of the views directory. And then inside of the products folder, we have a file called products.js. And this could be JS or JSX, and it will contain the products component. So you can think of this component as just the general products page where it might list all the products that are available right now or something like that. And then this component is going to have several child components that it's going to import and use. For example, each individual product is going to have its own component. For example, it might be called product display.js. And like I said, you can use JS or JSX. I personally prefer JSX because it makes it explicit that it's a component file, but you can do really whatever you want. Now let's actually go ahead and make our first component file. We are going to duplicate this structure right here. So let's open up the Explorer. I'm going to add a folder called views, and then inside of the views directory, we're going to add another folder called products for the products page. And then finally, inside of that, we're going to create a new file, and that is going to be products.jsx. So that step is done. Let's go ahead and look at the next one, which is to define a function. And the identifier of that function is going to be the same as the component name. So as you can see here, we are creating a simple arrow function. Nothing is happening inside of it, but it is called products, which is the same name as our component file. So let's go ahead and do this in our products.js file. We're just going to simply say const products, and that's going to be equal to an arrow function. And that's all for now. Now the next step is to return JSX markup from that component. And hopefully you are familiar with JSX syntax by now. I covered that in a previous video. If you're unfamiliar with it, go ahead and go back to that video if you need to review or just learn it from scratch. So let's go ahead and duplicate this code right here in VS Code. So we're going to add a new line in this function, and we're going to return an expression as signified by the parentheses. And inside of that, we're going to create a div, and it's going to have an ID of products. And inside of that div, we're going to create an h1 that contains the text products page. And obviously this is not a real world example. Normally what you would do is instead of having an h1 here, or maybe you would have an h1, but in addition to that, you would have a list of all the products that are available, or however you set it up. And we will be going into patterns such as that one in a later video in this course. So stick along for the ride and we will be covering things like that in no time. Now the final step to creating a functional component is to actually export that component from the file. And in order to understand this, you should be familiar with ES6 import and export syntax. If you're not, I will leave a link in the description where you can read up on it. So if you need to, pause the video right now, go learn about the import and export syntax in ES6, and then come back here. So as you can see on this slide, there are 3 different ways to export the component, which you will be familiar with if you understand the export and import syntax, but I'm going to review this very quickly anyway. So the easiest way is just to add the export keyword in front of your function declaration, and that will export the component without you having to write another line of code. Or at the bottom of the file, you can use a named export or a default export. To do a named export, just add the export keyword and then the name of the function. And to do a default export, use the export and the default keywords. So let's go back to our code file, and we're going to use a default export. It's just a habit of mine that I'm going to follow here. So I'm going to space down a couple lines and then say export default products. and that will allow other component files to import the products component and use it. Okay, so now on to the final part of this video. You can see I've changed a few things here in the file. So what I've done is I've created a new React app using the create React app command, as we learned in the previous videos. And then inside of the src folder, I created the same views directory and the same products directory and the same exact file as you can see right here. And so I'm just going to show you how to import this component into the app.js file and then render the products component. Okay, so inside of app.js, up at the top, we're going to say import products. And as you can see, VS Code is automatically detecting that there is a products component, but we are not going to use that right now for learning purposes. So let's just do this manually. Products, and we are going to import it from /views/products/products. And in React, we do not have to use the extension when importing components. It's not required. You can do it explicitly. It won't hurt anything, but it is not required, so most people don't do it. So now that we've imported it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear everything from the app component except for the top level containing element. And then inside of that, I'm just going to simply render the products component, just like that. And so now I'm going to go to the terminal and run the development server with npm start. And now that the app has rendered, you can see that our products component is actually rendering on the page. So that's how you actually import a functional component into another component and use it. So in the next video, we are going to look at the other side of the components coin, so to speak, and that is class-based components. They are very similar, but they use different syntax, and functional components are more popular and easier to use, which is why I've covered those first. But class components are still important, as you may have to edit somebody else's code that uses class components, or you may be reading documentation that uses them. Either way, it's really important to understand how class-based components work, even if you don't use them. So go on ahead to the next video, and I will see you there.